Where'd you find God or Jesus, or how did God find you?
Yeah, I think God found me. I had no idea that I had no idea that I was looking for God. I was completely happy in my life. I was not a seeker. I wasn't lonely. I had a good community of friends. I liked my work. So if I was a seeker, that was a surprise to me. That was not what I expected. I worked for years as a journalist, and being a journalist is a license to be nosy. You get to poke your nose in places and say what's going on here. And I used to live a little bit closer, and I walked by here early in the morning. It's a beautiful building. And one morning, it was Sunday and the doors were open, so I walked in to see what was going on. And there's a big round open space surrounded by that massive icon of dancing saints, which was gorgeous, but that was empty when I walked in. People were in the seating area, and they were sitting there, and it was silent, and then they were singing, and then there was somebody talking, and then they were silent, and they were singing. It's really pretty. It's very nice. I'm sure there was a sermon. I don't remember the sermon, but that was all great. It was sort of interesting. It was very pretty. And then everybody started walking in this sort of slow, stately dance with their hands on each other's shoulders up to the table. And we all went around it in a big circle singing. I don't remember what we sang, but it was beautiful. Singing and moving around the table. We got there, and then somebody started singing again and broke these loaves of bread and poured some wine and announced, Jesus welcomes everyone to his table, so we offer the bread and wine, which are Christ's body and blood, to everyone without exception. And then they carried the bread around and gave it to people, and people passed a chalice of wine to each other. So I had this experience of knowing two things at the same time. One was that I was eating regular bread. It was completely real homemade bread, and drinking sort of disgusting, sticky wine. And the other was that God, who I didn't believe in, was alive and was in my mouth. And that sort of finished that little experiment for the day. I got out of there as fast as I could. I just started to cry and ran out because I thought a Christian might try to talk to me. So that was the beginning of my conversion. Unfortunately, conversion is not something that happens to you once and then everything's better. My life got much more complicated in many ways. And that understanding that I knew something was real, though I didn't believe it, persisted and still persists, right? But I know this thing is real. And, I think partly because of who I am, Jesus came to me in a way that was incredibly physical, right? It wasn't intellectual. I try not to be an anti-intellectual, but that's not how I understand the world. And my experience in this place, which was real bread, real wine, real somebody else's hands, real somebody else's voice, was incredibly powerful.
And that's it?
Well, that's not exactly it, because I kept coming back, though I didn't really want to come back because I was hungry. And over a period of months, I got drawn into participating, because this was a church that really wanted to integrate strangers who might not be ready, who didn't know what they were looking for, into the work, in the faith that God will find you when you're unprepared. God will find you when you're not ready. God will find you when you're not deserving. God will make God's self known to you through doing this work of liturgy together. You don't have to figure it out, and you don't have to prepare for it. It's like, ready or not, here I am. So I kept drawing near, as we say in the service, draw near, and I began to serve in the services. I began to hand bread and wine to other people. I began to get closer around the table and offer bread to other people. And I decided two things. One was I decided to be baptized. And the same weekend I was baptized, I decided we launched our food pantry, because I had thought, well, here we are at this table, sharing bread and wine with people who don't deserve it, and God's in it. Well, let's do this as much as we possibly can. The altar is beautiful. It's this carved table because we all stand to take communion. We all come really close around it. It's not, we don't stand in a circle. It's sort of a mob crowds the table. And the altar has two things written on it in these beautiful illuminated gold letters. On one side, in Greek, there's a phrase from Luke's Gospel, and it says, "This guy eats with sinners." And on the other side of the table, there's a quote from Isaac of Nineveh, this mystic from the 7th century. And it says, "Did not our Lord dine with publicans and harlots? Therefore, make no distinction between worthy and unworthy. All must be equal in your eyes to love and to serve." So that was pretty clear to me, that we, the things that we do in worship mean something, and they're a guide to our whole lives, in church and out of church. It's not as if there's worship and then there's everything else. Worship is the way that we learn to have a relationship with God in everything. And so the principles of the worship that I discovered at St. Gregory's were the same principles that underlay the food pantry. So the food pantry wasn't a good deed. It wasn't a social service program. It wasn't like, let's do something for the poor people. It was like, A, this is for everybody, deserving or undeserving, ready or not ready. B, we're not doing something for other people. We're doing it with them. So the people who come to get food are the people who are running the pantry. The people who come to get food are in charge of handing bread to other people. Just as I was incorporated into the worshiping community by being given work, by being given things to do, by being given responsibility, by being accepted as somebody who, because I was a stranger and an outsider, had something that the Spirit was offering to the community, right? And so that's the way we ran the food pantry. So we don't say you have to fill out forms, you have to be good, you have to be deserving. We just say, Jesus welcomes everyone to his table, right? And we don't say, why don't you come in and do it the way we like to do it and dress the way we dress. And if you're really good and obedient for about a year, we'll let you do a little thing, but not too much, because we have volunteers who know how to do it better than you do, right? I just would go up to guys on the line and say, hey, can you help me? And then they'd start to say, God, Sarah, the way you do this is so stupid. Let me show you a better way to do that, right? Because the food pantry is a living community. It's church, just the way Sunday is church. And God is making God's self known through the work of the community. And over, God is busting it open and messing it up so that we have to see a little bit more.
It sounds like, no offense there, but it sounds irresponsible and unsustainable and messy. It sounds like you need a little bit more structure in order to scale up.
Right. One of the most idolatrous things in the world is the idea of efficiency. God is not efficient. Have you noticed that? God is like so not efficient. God is just merciful. God is over the top frequently. But God is never very good at measuring things out accurately. You know, the pantry, as I said, is not a social service program. It is a Eucharistic community, and that is messy. It's not simple, it's complicated. And just as on Sundays I sometimes want to strangle the parishioners, on Fridays I sometimes want to strangle the people at the pantry. And I'm sure they feel exactly the same way about me. But we're being made into a people who wasn't a people was being made into God's people. And we don't know how it's going to turn out. We just can tell that it's happening.
I always wanted to stand up here and say I've got my sermon on my phone because I think it's so modern, and I do, but I want to show it to you. It's not really a sermon though, don't be too worried. So it looks like that. So you can see, hopefully it's going to be short unless I get carried away. But before I do that, I'm trying to tie together the theme that was in the video with the readings, and I probably haven't done it terribly well. I've just touched on a few aspects of the readings, but I wanted to start by saying, with what Nick read, you're all weighed down with all this heavy armour, and you're fighting the devil, and you're fighting the principalities and powers, but don't forget what's happening to your feet. Does anyone remember what's happening to your feet when you've got the armour of this and the... No one remembers what happened to your feet. Well, your feet should be... The what, sorry?
Well, it doesn't say a specific thing, it just says what you need to help you on your way.
What you need to help you on your way. Well, actually, it's actually a bit simpler than that, what's happening to your feet, because your feet should be ready. Your feet are filled with readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. So it's forget all about all that armour and all the battling that you're going to do. Your feet, where you are standing on this ground, are in readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. Last night I went to the footy, and I don't want you to think that I'm a football fanatic, because I know that you all think that I'm a heavy metal fanatic from my talk in April. But I went to the football because every now and again my friend has a spare ticket and he says, come along, so off I went. We sat behind the goalposts. So I had a really good view of, not a very good view of the match, because you can't really see the distances, and it's hard to see everyone running around when you sit behind the goalpost. But what I could see was the linesmen, the people that were the umpires, and I could see the goal umpire. And I watched quite intently because it was very interesting. There were 54,000 people at the football last night, and it was exciting and sad, red for the Sydney Swans. But the linesmen were, it's a ritual, and it's a very precise ritual. When a goal or a point is scored, they have to stand to attention, and then they eyeball the person at the other end so that they do it in unison. And if it's a point, it's like that. And then it's grab the flag, unfurl the flag and wave the flag. Okay? If it's a goal, of course, you know it's 2, and they have to do it in unison. And then they go over and they unfurl this flag and that flag on each goalpost. And then I can't demonstrate it, but they wave it this way, that way, and up and down, and they do it exactly the same at both ends. And it's obvious that these people have practiced and practiced and practiced how to do the waving of the flags and the standing to attention. But what I found more interesting was when the ball goes out of bounds. And I watched these guys, it came out of bounds several times close to where I was sitting. And what they have to do, I'm going to demonstrate it, but I'll have to walk away from the microphone for a second. So the ball's gone out, and then they grab the ball and they've got to throw it over their shoulder. And how they do that is kind of like this. They hold the ball, they put the ball up to their head, they then take a deep breath. Then they put the ball down and then they toss it over like that. And they do it in exactly the same way every time. So you might think, what on earth has this got to do with Jesus saying about bread and wine? Well, I think it's got everything to do with it. And that's because I think that very often we are conditioned to think, when we hear the reading that Joyce read, we're conditioned to think that it's talking about the Eucharist, or that it's talking about the Lord's Supper or the communion or whatever you want to call it, when we share bread and wine. And you've got a very good picture of that in the video, that it's people are dancing around, but ultimately it's all about a sacrament. And when you've got 54,000 people, then everything has to be precise. So the ritual is important. And I guess as the church grew from the early days, a ritual had to be established around the sharing of bread and wine, and eventually it became institutionalised, and more or less in the form that most Christian churches use it today. Every Christian church more or less follows the same formula around the breaking of bread. My problem with it is this. When Jesus said this, he hadn't had the Last Supper. So why is it that the disciples and the followers are all upset about Jesus saying you have to eat the bread and drink the wine? Why is it that they're upset? Well, it reminds me of my childhood, because we used to go to church and once a month we had the communion, and if I sat next to my father and the minister said, eat the bread and drink the blood, you'd hear this little grunt from my father every time. It was like, because he couldn't stomach the idea. I think I've mentioned that before. He hated this idea that we were drinking blood and eating flesh. And I think that's probably, in my view, why the disciples were so upset. Here was a man saying, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven, or you're not my disciples, or whatever it was he was arguing in the story. Well, that might be taking the story too literally, because let's face facts. The story that we read today was written in the Jonean tradition around about 90 to 110 AD. So it was written 60 to 80 years after the events of Easter, after the events of the Last Supper, after the events or the stories about what Jesus taught his disciples. So then the second question that came into my mind, and I do tie it into this in a minute, is what was going on in the early church that led the writer to talk about needing to eat the flesh and drink the blood of Jesus. So I did a little bit of research about it, and I discovered that, in fact, the Eucharist really wasn't properly instituted until about 70 AD, because most of the Christians were meeting in the synagogue. And they had a shared meal and they got together outside the synagogue, but around about 70 AD there was a big split between the Christians and the Jews. The Christians were a Jewish sect, a part of Judaism, but they split. So sometime in the following 20 years, the beginnings of Christian institutions, Christian Eucharist, baptism and so forth became more prominent because they were running the show themselves. I still am on my one page, by the way. But actually my phone's just shut down. Hang on, I've got to go back. I've got to remember my code. Okay. Actually, I'm on point 4 and I've got 7 points. That's not bad. Okay. So the question still comes up. What on earth is this all about? And I've come to the conclusion, particularly because of what was described as happening in the early church at the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century, is that they didn't really have a strong institution of the Eucharist. What they had was a gathering and what they called an agape meal. And the agape meal wasn't just bread and wine, it was a feast. So people got together and they shared a feast, just like in this video. And in the sharing of the feast, they shared not necessarily the body and blood of Christ, but the humanity of Christ. The humanity of Christ. Christ is flesh and blood. And I think that's where I see the connection between what we saw on the video and what I'm going to describe in 3 minutes about what we are perhaps trying to achieve here on a Tuesday, and I'll explain that. So I'm suggesting that the essential reference to the body and blood and the sharing and eating is really about entering into and living in the humanity, the humanness of Jesus, and that we all share that together. We're all part of that humanity. So coming back to what Raymond spoke about last week, and I thought it was excellent what we heard about the sharing of bread, about Jesus saying, "I am the bread of life." He talked about it meaning love and belonging. And I think that's what we see here in this video as well. A lot of the commentators on this talk about the word abiding, and I think I've come to the conclusion that it's talking about living in the central humanity of Jesus. So how does Tuesday, what happens here, fit in with this idea? Does it fit the model? And in some ways I think it does, and in other ways I think it doesn't. For those who don't know, on Tuesday we have a choir that meets here. They're called Sydney Sings. They sing 60s mainly songs, pop songs. Robert plays the piano, and there's maybe between 60 and sometimes 100 people come and sing along. Mix of people, not a lot of people that belong to this congregation, but some. Others that are just workers that like to come and sing in a non-traditional choir. There are some people that have mental health problems. There are others that identify as homeless. So it's a pretty mixed bag. And as a community, we take the responsibility for providing a supper. And so we have a group of volunteers that come each Tuesday and help put together the food, and then another group of volunteers that clean up afterwards. So the idea is to sing together and then join together in a shared meal. I'm not sure that it's this, but it's somewhere around that idea of being welcoming and saying, here's a space that we can all be a part of, and you're welcome into this setting and we're sharing a meal together. The problem is we do have a slight dilemma at the moment, and it's nothing to do with having enough volunteers, so don't get too worried. I'm not going to point a finger at you and say, come and help. We've got volunteers. The problem is somebody who comes along, I won't mention a name, who wants us to serve up everything on cardboard boxes. And we, as the volunteers, unpack all the food that comes from Oz Harvest, and we have all these platters, and we try and make the food look nice. We try and present it well, and this particular person is saying, oh no, it's too much cleaning up, you know, we haven't got enough people to clean up afterwards. Just leave it all in the cardboard boxes, don't do any preparation, just stick it all out, we'll manage, you know, etc., etc. And I was thinking about that, and this, and that, and I was thinking, you know, it's worth the effort because it communicates something about respect and about invitation and about welcome. And I think that's really what we're all here about. We're here about representing the humanity of Jesus and about sharing the space and about showing respect to all. And that's it. Amen.